It was a cold winter night, deep in the Russian countryside. The road, deserted and winding, wound between the vast dark forests, whose bare trees seemed to reach towards the sky like arms of shadow ready to swallow up passers-by. The snow fell gently, forming an immaculate blanket on the ground, broken only by the wheels of vehicles or the footsteps of intruders. The glow of the street lamps, faint and timid, cast long, spectral shadows, casting a pale orange light on the frozen landscape. Everything seemed suspended in absolute silence, as if the world itself was holding its breath.
In there, a palpable tensión dense and heavy.
It was the kind of calm that precedes a storm, a foreboding that threaded through the veins of the earth, a whisper in the icy breeze. Everything seemed to indicate that this night would not be like the others. Nature itself seemed to hold its breath. In the distance, a silhouette appeared in the darkness, then another. The roar of the engines finally broke this imposing silence. A group of bikers, the ghosts of the asphalt, was heading at full speed towards the capital. The engines of their motorcycles screamed in the night, tearing the air with incredible violence. The noise of their machines, heavy and rumbling, seemed to engulf everything, as if the earth itself was quivering under their passage. These ruthless men and women, dressed in worn black leather, their jackets adorned with gleaming chains and skulls, had made their reputation on the roads. Their legend was woven of violence and chaos, pillage and terror. Wherever they passed, fear spread like wildfire. They were not just criminals, they were living symbols of rebellion, anarchists by nature, rejecting the established order at every turn. The group was led by an imposing man, a colossus named Igor. His massive stature and his face marked by scars, testifying to his years spent fighting, commanded respect and fear. His black beard, thick and wild, adorned his hard face, and his icy blue eyes shone with a gleam of challenge. He wasn't afraid. Tonight, he had made a decision that would shake up the entire system he had always hated. Tonight he would strike at the heart of the Kremlin, of Russia itself. They think they are untouchable, Igor growled through gritted teeth. We are going to show them that they are not invincible. We are going to show Putin that he is only one man, and that no man is above the law. He let out a cruel smile, a smile only seen on those who have lost all illusion of pity. The other bikers nodded silently, their gazes hard as steel, their fingers gripping the handles of their motorcycles. There was no going back. What they had planned was risky, but the reward would be great. Their audacity, fueled by hatred of oppression and power, pushed them forward. As they approached Moscow, they slowed down. Their motorcycles growled less loudly now, the road becoming narrower and winding. Outside the city, they stopped in front of an isolated manor, a vast and remote estate. The mansion was surrounded by high stone walls, and only a faint distant light allowed a glimpse of its imposing silhouette, lost in the darkness. It was there that Putin, the president of Russia, spent his retirement moments away from the political hustle and bustle of the capital. Their informants had given them detailed information. The Russian leader was here, in this mansion, far from his bodyguards, sheltered from his political obligations. The target was vulnerable. It was the perfect opportunity to strike. The plan was simple: break into the mansion, capture Putin, and force him to give in to their demands. After all, who would dare resist them? A man alone, without protection, was nothing in the face of their anger. They crept silently, their boots crunching on the fresh snow, their gazes piercing the darkness. They slipped into the shadows, thinking no one could see them. But the atmosphere seemed to be working against them. Something in the coldness of the night, in the way the snow settled on the ground, seemed to betray them. Maybe, deep down, they weren't the only ones aware of the danger. But what they didn't know was that this night would not be like any other. Putin, secluded in his chambers, trained in a secret room in his mansion, a place only a small circle of close friends knew. The room was austere, minimally furnished, but the atmosphere was marked by intense concentration. On each side of the room, mirrors as high as walls reflected his image, allowing him to perfect his movements with pinpoint precision. The hardwood floor creaked slightly under his feet, echoing in the cold air. He was not just a politician. As a former KGB agent, he had learned from a young age the importance of discipline, control, and physical strength. Since his early years in the security forces, Putin had honed his body and mind in multiple martial arts, developing skills that went far beyond the expectations of a simple leader. His black belt in karate was not a simple accessory. It was a testament to his skill, his mastery, and his ability to defend himself without ever losing his composure. Karate, with its fluid and powerful movements, had forged his reputation as a strategist in both the political and physical arenas. He was not the man to be underestimated. He knew that in this world of intrigue and conspiracy, brute force could sometimes be the key to survival. As he executed a series of punches and blocks with the speed of a snake, his concentration was complete. Every gesture was perfect, every movement was a natural extension of his body, as if he were in total symbiosis with the energy of the room. Sweat beaded on his forehead, but his face remained implacable, his eyes fixed on his reflection in the mirror. Training, even at his age, was not an option for him, it was a necessity. But suddenly, the roar of the motorcycle engines vibrated the ground beneath his feet, breaking the silence. The sound grew more and more intense, a menacing rumble that invaded the room. Putin stopped dead in his tracks, his gaze instantly becoming more piercing, as if every fiber of his being was on alert. The sound of the engines was not that of a simple night ride. It was a sound of war. He knew what that meant.
Atreat, clear and imminent.
He had always been prepared for anything, but tonight the looming plot seemed more serious than usual. He felt that this time he couldn't just rely on the usual security. This time, he would have to defend himself alone, like a man facing his attackers. He put on a light jacket methodically, his movements precise, almost mechanical. He spoke to an intercom hidden in the wall, but he didn't wait for a response. He already knew the situation. Panic would only hamper his senses. He moved quickly towards the back door, a passage he had carefully chosen for its discretion. Silent as a shadow, he slipped through the night, his steps light despite his age. The bitter cold of the Russian winter did not seem to affect him. It was in moments like this that Putin thrived, a familiar feeling of preparedness and extreme calm, like a beast on the hunt. Outside, the bikers had taken up positions around the mansion, their massive silhouettes silhouetted against the snow. They knew he was inside. They had spotted him, their informants having played their role. But what they didn't anticipate was that Putin was waiting for them. He was not just a president. He wasn't a man who was going to go down without a fight. They thought they had the advantage, thought he would be easy prey, but they were sorely mistaken. When Igor entered the house with his men, the interior seemed quiet, too quiet. They advanced cautiously, their footsteps loud on the old parquet floor. The place was deserted except for a figure standing in the darkness, in the shadow of a large marble pillar. The dim lights cast shadows that danced on the walls, but everything seemed frozen, unreal. Igor frowned and took a few steps forward, his eyes searching for details in the dim light. Then, suddenly, he burst into contemptuous laughter when he recognized the figure. Well, if it's not Putin himself. Igor sneered, his voice echoing throughout the great hall, full of arrogant confidence. He approached again, his arms crossed, and a cruel smile appeared on his face marked by violence. He seemed to believe that victory was already his. The group of bikers followed him, their treacherous gazes scanning every corner of the room. But Putin's gaze, impassive, remained fixed on Igor, like a predator who never loses sight of his prey. He slowly turned towards him, his expression icy. He wasn't afraid. He was never afraid. His calm was absolute. "You made a big mistake in coming here," he replied in a calm but confident voice. The bikers burst into laughter, thinking that Putin was already frightened, easy prey just waiting for a decisive blow to give in to raw violence. They were convinced that the Russian president, isolated in his mansion, had lost all chance of defending himself. However, in a movement of relentless precision, Putin launched himself forward, his body reacting instantly to the threat. He was no longer the politician we see in conferences or on television screens. He was the KGB's elite, the disciplined student of close combat. Within seconds, he executed a series of fluid, graceful movements, his arms and legs extending in perfect sequence, each movement a combination of power and flexibility. The bikers, stunned by the speed and control of the man they thought was weak, were immediately disoriented. Two of the attackers found themselves disarmed, their weapons falling to the ground with a metallic clank. Before their brains even had time to react, Putin threw a third biker to the ground, sending him flying like a rag doll. The air was heavy with tension. The other bikers stopped for a moment, watching the scene in disbelief. But Igor, the instigator of this incursion, did not let himself be destabilized. His gaze, hard as steel, fixed on Putin, and with new rage, he launched into the confrontation, brandishing an iron bar. He struck with such force that you could almost hear the air tearing with each movement. But Putin, far from being intimidated, dodged the blow with surprising agility for a man of his age. The movement was almost imperceptible, fluid, like a snake weaving between obstacles. He approached quickly, too quickly for Igor to have time to understand what was happening. With a precise blow, he struck the iron bar with his hand, breaking it in two with a shard of metal that echoed in the cold night air. The bar, broken in two, fell into pieces, leaving Igor unarmed and helpless. Putin, in an even faster movement, found himself facing him, his eyes staring into those of his opponent. A slight smile appeared on Putin's lips, a smile marked by calm and control, as if he were simply in a routine test. "This is not the first time I have faced enemies greater than myself," he said in a low, sure voice, his words ringing in Igor's soul like a warning bell. This was not empty bravado. It was a truth, forged by years of confrontation, power struggles, and trials of survival. The fight continued, but the outcome was already obvious. Igor, despite his imposing size and brutality, found himself trapped in a dance that he did not understand. He had counted on his strength and boldness, thinking that Putin, as an aging man removed from physical combat, would be vulnerable. But he did not understand that, for Putin, every battle was a game of wits, a dance between speed, strategy, and use of the environment. The bikers, like their leader, suddenly found themselves disoriented, caught in the trap set by Putin's absolute control. Every assault Igor made, every attempted strike or grab, was countered with such fluidity that he didn't even have time to understand what hit him before he was immobilized or thrown backwards. He was a roaring lion, but when faced with a silent serpent, he was incapable of reacting. When the last rider fell to the ground with a thud, collapsing like a rock hit by a swell, the space around Putin seemed to fill with silence. Igor, furious, turned towards his opponent, his breathing heavy, his face contorted with rage. The reality of the situation dawned on him with each passing second, but he refused to admit it to himself. "You are an old fool," Igor spat, his face twisted with hatred. "But even a madman has his limits." Putin didn't respond immediately, his eyes staring at Igor with icy intensity, as if trying to read his soul, to understand the extent of his madness. Each breath seemed suspended in the cold night air, the weight heavy. Then, with a movement as quick as an arrow, he lunged forward, his body propelling itself with the precision of a predator that knew exactly where to strike. Igor, too slow, too unprepared, didn't even have time to react. With a sharp, controlled blow, Putin toppled him to the ground, the impact of Igor's body hitting the deep snow ringing like a warning in the frigid air. A heavy silence followed, a sort of calm before the storm. "Your mistake was not just trying to defy me," Putin said, his voice calm, but each word hitting the air with the force of a hammer blow. "It was believing that you could win by brute force alone." He stood up slowly, his gaze still fixed on Igor, an aura of absolute calm surrounding him. Putin's fists were clenched, but he showed no trace of fatigue. It was not anger that guided him, but total control of the situation. The air around him seemed to vibrate with a controlled energy, a tension that announced the imminent end of a losing struggle. Igor, panting and slowly rising from the snow, looked up at his opponent. He was no longer the ruthless man he was when he arrived, but a man trapped in his own arrogance. Fear, mixed with respect, could be read in his eyes, like a breach opening in his original confidence. It was the realization of an irreparable error. For the first time since the start of the confrontation, Igor realized that he had underestimated Putin, that he had believed he could beat him by relying solely on brute violence and physical force. But Putin, even in his position as political leader, was not a man to be underestimated. He knew that true power lay in self-control, in the art of combat that goes far beyond mere brawn and brutality. It was an art that Igor had not understood, an art that only he seemed to possess. Putin stared at his opponent for a moment longer, his gaze as penetrating as ever. Then, in a firm but calm tone, he ordered, "Leave here, before the situation deteriorates further." The words, cold and sharp, were a final warning. Igor and the other bikers, now broken and humiliated, trembled under the intensity of this implacable gaze. There was no room for doubt or discussion. Putin was not a man to be intimidated. He was in control of the situation, and his victory was inevitable. The bikers, aware of their defeat, slowly got up, each of them taking a moment to realize the situation they found themselves in. The fear was tangible, embedded in their bodies, in the way they looked at Putin as if they were confronted with something much bigger than themselves. Without another word, they mounted their motorcycles, their faces marked with shame and confusion. Their engines roared as they fled, disappearing into the black night, swallowed up by the darkness of the surrounding forest. They didn't even turn around. They knew they had lost, and that this defeat was not only physical, but psychological. Putin stood still for a moment, staring in the direction where the bikers had fled. Silence fell again, as heavy as the snow that was still falling, covering the scene with a thick blanket of white. The wind, slightly colder, blew through the trees, carrying with it the echo of the missing engines. Putin watched them leave, his gaze impassive, but in his mind he knew his message had been clear. This was not a confrontation that could be won by brute violence, but by strategy, self-control, and discipline. Strength and discipline were powerful allies, yes, but true victory lay in the ability to overpower not only one's adversaries, but also oneself. Every movement he made, every gesture, had been a show of control. For Putin, true strength lay in this ability to remain calm, even in the most extreme moments. He had not just defeated the bikers on the physical field, but in the mental and strategic field. He knew that fear could be an even sharper weapon than force. He turned on his heel and walked slowly towards the mansion, his steps crunching the snow under his boots. The danger had passed. But in his mind, the night had confirmed a truth that would only strengthen his reputation. True power lies in mastery, and he who possesses that mastery is invincible.